Good evening, everyone. People are still filtering in a little bit because this format is slightly different to the way that we normally do public lectures at the Academy. We normally have a bit of a mill around beforehand, but because we wanted to have an opportunity for people to meet Mike informally after the lecture, we decided to do the lecture first. So a few people may still filter in, but we will start this evening. So I'd like to formally welcome you to the Australian Academy of Science for tonight's public talk by Professor Mike Rawpack on the topic of past, present and future of environmental science in Australia. This is the third Academy event in National Science Week, and I'd like to thank you this evening for choosing this event in National Science Week for today. My name's Sue Meek. I'm the Chief Executive here at the Academy, and it's my privilege to be chairing this evening's session. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people of the Wiradjuri Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the Australian Academy of Science is built, and we also share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices, and as we do that, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. So I mentioned that this was the third event that we had held. Last Thursday we held the ACT National Science Week's launch here at the Dome with some fireworks and some ice displays and a whole lot of things that was going on basically. And also on that day we held the first ever Women in Science Wikibomb event, which was an event to create Wikipedia pages for a diverse range of Australian women scientists. Tonight, we're going to examine an area of science that is fundamental to our quality of life and the nation's future prosperity. So Professor Mike Rawpack, our speaker for this evening, is one of Australia's leading experts on climate change. He was recently appointed as Director of the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University, following a long and successful career at CSIRO. As an elected fellow of this academy, Mike has also been very generous with his time and expertise. He was a major contributor to the development of the Academy's Climate Change Science Question and Answer booklet that was released in 2010, and copies are usually around the Dome here somewhere if you're interested. This document endeavoured to summarise the latest science in an accessible way to address the most commonly asked questions on this complex and sometimes very controversial topic. And he's currently integrally involved in preparing an update that will be available later this year, which takes into account the science that's been developed since that 2010 booklet. In addition to that, he's leading a major academy project, Australia 2050, which is examining living scenarios to explore how we might negotiate a future that is both socially and environmentally equitable in Australia. So his contributions are valued at many levels. And from this, it will be very clear to you that Professor Rawpack is well placed to address us on his chosen topic this evening, where he'll be taking a big picture view on the state of Australian environmental science, taking stock of where we've been, where we are now, and where we might go in the future. So please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Rawpack. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal people, on whose land we meet this evening. This lecture is a privilege to give, and I'd like to acknowledge many colleagues, too many to name, except to indicate on the slide you see some of the institutions within which I've been privileged to work with them. ANU, CSIRO, some international organisations, the Global Carbon Project and Future Earth, and the projects that Sue mentioned in the Academy. It's worth recalling as we begin to address this topic that until a few decades ago, the idea of the environment was scarcely current in our culture. If we go back 2 centuries, we had the idea of natural philosophy, the holistic science or components of a holistic science of the natural world. through those 2 centuries, we became somewhat fragmented, and we broke up into disciplines, disciplinary silos, sometimes called, from which it became rather hard for one silo to see another. But over the last few decades, things have changed, and some iconic images help us to appreciate the way in which this change has happened. This perhaps is one of the most iconic. It's a view of our Earth from 36,000 kilometres up in geostationary orbit. These images are now common, of course, but for me they're always powerful, and they remind us that when we stand back far enough, our Earth looks quite small. The second iconic image is one that zooms in somewhat. It's also taken from space. It's an image, a composite from NASA NOAA satellites showing the Earth lights, the lights of human civilization as seen from space. And what we see is that our planet glows. We, humankind, are having a visible effect from space on our planet. The map we see is more or less a map of wealth or income per unit area. And you see over here, of course, the bright lights of Europe and the USA, the civilizations, the bright lights of South America, South Africa, increasingly in the developing parts of Asia, and of course Australia, with just a few lights. We're a relatively lowly populated country, although quite wealthy. The third image zooms in closer yet to the Earth. It's a graph, it's not a picture. It's the famous Keeling curve. That's Charles Keeling on the right. In 1959, he began monitoring the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. And that monitoring has continued ever since, and the result is this curve. And what we see is the concentration of carbon dioxide increasing from about 317 parts per million when he began monitoring, up to its current level of roughly 400 parts per million. In a year or so, it's going to cross an average of 400 parts per million. It's already crossed 400 parts per million in peaks, in excursions. This curve is one of the most powerful documents that we have that demonstrates the effect that humans are having on the natural environment. And I'll return to this theme a couple of times in this talk. So what I'd like to do is to spend a fair fraction of this talk enthusing, because I think celebrating the enormous successes of Australian environmental science is a really important thing to do, and I want to do that with great vigour. Then, towards the end of the talk, I'll move to a couple of broader topics: the issue of synthesis, how we pull together our environmental knowledge, and in conclusion, how our environmental science relates to the broader polity, to the society that we live in, both in Australia and worldwide. So, in terms of examples of Australian environmental science, I want to have a look in a little bit of detail at our work in the atmosphere, oceans, how we measure the carbon cycle and other biogeochemical cycles. I'll allude to, without much opportunity to explore in more detail, our work on the water cycle. By our, of course, I mean the Australian community. Our work on the biosphere and ecosystems and soils, and our work in marine environments. So this first slide in the part of the talk where I want to enthuse is about ecosystems and landscapes, and it celebrates the fact that Australian science has made enormous contributions to the study of ecosystems and biodiversity in land, in coastal and marine environments. It's made great strides in studying the way the biosphere functions, how the terrestrial hydrosphere, the water on our continent, flows and supplies available water for human consumption. That particular photograph is one of the the iconic ecosystems in Australia, cool temperate rainforests in Tasmania. Of course, we're concerned both with iconic ecosystems, but also with much more familiar landscapes that we live in day by day, at least most of us do. This particular one is near Goulburn. It's a highly managed landscape, and there have been great strides in the science of landscapes like this, all the way from under the ground, the soils and the living organisms below the ground, up to through the biosphere and to the air above. And in that air, on the particular day that this photograph was taken by a colleague of mine, there's a thunderstorm. And that provides a segue to the fact that the study of our environment is carried out not only by great leaps of insight and imagination, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, by long-term and careful and continuous monitoring. And the single biggest monitoring system that we have is one that almost all of us use every day. It's this one, the Bureau of Meteorology's Weather Network. We take for granted the fact that we can now rely, to a large extent, on weather forecasts up to about a week in advance. 20 or 30 years ago, this was not the case. The science that underpins that ability is enormous, and it's based on modelling, but also on very careful monitoring. That monitoring ranges in scale from monitoring on the surface through conventional weather stations like the one you see on the left, through radar. I didn't have the opportunity to include a picture of a rain radar image of the sort that you see every day if you download one on your iPhone. Satellite observations, the one on the upper right is a satellite cloud picture from about 2 hours ago. And of course, all of this information gets fed into numerical models that enable us to make numerical weather predictions. And the picture on the lower right is the surface weather pattern nowcast, that is the current state of the pressure systems, also about 2 hours ago. And this picture highlights a couple of important things. The first is that nothing about this network, this enormous network, can be taken for granted. One of the important attributes of our weather network is that substantial parts of it, in fact, are degrading. The network is under threat. Across the world and in Australia, we're seeing a reduction in the number of surface stations, like that one on the left. That is something that we should not be complacent about. We need our weather network. We need it to provide that service that was alluded to on the last slide. The skill of this forecast ability that we have has been improving steadily over many years. This shows a plot of a measure of forecast skill, never mind what it is, but roughly speaking, it represents our ability to make a forecast at various time intervals, 3 days in advance, 5 and 7 and 10 days in advance. The skills plotted on the vertical axis, and the bottom axis, the horizontal axis, is time running from 1981 up to last year, 2013. In fact, I think there's some data there from this year. And there, for each of the forecast intervals that you see there, 3, 5 and 7 days, there are 2 lines. The first is for the skill of the Northern Hemisphere forecast, and the second for the Southern Hemisphere forecast. And what you see is a couple of things. You see that forecast skill has been increasing progressively and steadily throughout this time. And the reasons for that increase are several. First, increased skill in the numerical weather models that do the forecasts. Second, the vastly increased amount of data that's going into those forecasts, of which the most important are the data that we get from space. The single biggest contribution to this increased skill is the fact that we can see our weather from space. And the third thing we see is that the northern and the southern hemisphere skills have more or less converged. As of about 10 or 15 years ago, the difference between them is negligible. Back in 1981, this was certainly not the case. The northern hemisphere could be forecast much, much better than the southern hemisphere. And the reason for that essentially is that in the northern hemisphere, by the standards of those days, there were many, many more observations. They were mostly surface observations. And of course, the northern hemisphere was much more densely observed than the southern for a series of obvious reasons. So the forecast skills have converged. They've continued to increase. Skills at the 3-day mark are approaching 95% or even better. You see also something very important about weather, which is that down towards the 10-day mark, skills are still pretty ordinary. They're not very good at all. And this is not the fact that the models are bad. It is the fact that there's a fundamental limit to do with the chaotic nature of our weather systems. It's called the predictability limit, and it kicks in at somewhere around 10 to 14 days. And it's to do with the fact that beyond that time, the weather systems are so sensitive to small disturbances now that they take off in completely different trajectories over a time of about 14 days. It's unlikely that we're going to be able to do deterministic forecasts, that is, forecasts of actual weather systems, beyond timescales like that. On the other hand, our ability to do statistical forecasts, will the next season be a wet one or a dry one, that remains a great and open challenge. So we can also take these weather forecasts and turn them into projections and hindcasts of water in Australia. And this particular slide shows the results of a project in which many colleagues and I participated over the last 10 years or so, called the Australian Water Availability Project, where we took the weather observations from the Bureau of Meteorology, took the history all the way back to 1900, and worked out from that its implications for the water balance of the continent. How much water is falling as rain, how much is evaporating, how much is running off into rivers and groundwater. And this shows a snapshot of the results of that project, in which you see in the left-hand column of maps running from 2013 down to 2007. For some reason, there's a bit of an overflow there. The maximum daily temperature. Warm colours mean hotter than average. Cool colours are cooler than average. And this is a kind of snapshot of the climate history over the last 7 years. In the same data set, you can see maps of the same sort running all the way back to 1900. The next column is rainfall. Likewise, warm colours are dry, cool colours are wet. You see very clearly the wet period in 2010, 2011, and you see at the beginning of that period signs of the long drought in Australia from about 2000 to 2009. That drought, the Big Dry, as it's popularly called, was a major event for many, many people. You also see soil moistures, upper layer and lower layer, and total runoff, the final column on the right, and that is basically a measure of how much water we have available, combining groundwater and surface flows into rivers, across the whole of the continent. Back now to the Keeling curve, and I want to zoom in now on the Australian contributions to the measurements of atmospheric composition, beginning with carbon dioxide, the quantity shown here. And of course, we all know why carbon dioxide is so important. It's because it's the single most important contributor as a greenhouse gas to human-induced global warming. In 1970, my colleague Graham Pearman who was at that stage near the beginning of his career in CSIRO in Melbourne, was looking at Keeling's observations, and he thought Keeling was wrong. He thought that what Keeling was seeing up to a point about there was not an increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it was instrumental drift. And we need to remember that in those days, and to some extent still, measuring carbon dioxide is not a trivial thing to do. It's something that demands very careful precision, careful calibration, and so on. So Graham at that time set up an observation site at what has now become the site of the Cape Grim Baseline Atmospheric Observatory on the northwest coast of Tasmania. That's the far northwestern tip of Tasmania that you see. This is a modern photograph of the site. Back in 1972, Graham began the first measurements there from a caravan, and he said that he started those measurements to prove Keeling wrong, but after 6 months he knew Keeling was right. This is science at its best. This is a great credit to Graham that he tested the hypothesis, came to the right conclusion, a conclusion that's been borne out many, many times since then. And from that beginning, an important beginning, this observatory on the northwest coast of Tasmania has grown to the point where it now measures over 100 species, most of them gases in the atmosphere, some of them particulate species, and some of them things like isotope ratios. And the long-term high-precision measurements began from 1976 onward. It's managed jointly by the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO. One of the important things that was done right from the beginning at Cape Grim, and this was extraordinarily far-sighted, was to take one of these flasks every month and fill it with air. The flask is evacuated, and so it contains a vacuum. It's taken to Cape Grim, and under controlled conditions, the valve is opened and the flask is filled with air. It's then taken back to Aspendale in Melbourne and stored in this air archive. That means that we have available a historic record of the air at Cape Grim running all the way back to 1972. Why would that be useful? The answer is that as technology has evolved and as our ability to measure has evolved, this air archive makes it possible to go back in time and to get records of the concentrations of things that we simply could not measure in those days. And this may well continue. So this air archive remains an absolutely critical resource. Paul Fraser, by the way, is the person who began the air archive and continues to oversee it. Here's an example of what we see from the combination of the Cape Grim record and the air archive. The top picture shows the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, mirroring quite closely what's happening elsewhere in the world, especially Charles Keeling's measurements at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. The next picture shows something a little more subtle. It's the composition of the isotopes in the carbon dioxide. There are two stable isotopes of carbon, carbon-12, which is most of the carbon that we breathe and eat and everything, and carbon-13, one extra neutron in the carbon-13 atom. About 1% of natural carbon is carbon-13, thereabouts. And the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 is very important, and it tells us very useful things about the air. It acts like a signature of the source of the carbon dioxide in the air, because different sources of carbon dioxide have different ratios, different 13 to 12 ratios. What you see here is a decline, the middle picture, in the carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratio, which is related to the fact that we're putting fossil fuels into the atmosphere, and those fossil fuels, relative to the air that's ambient in the atmosphere, are depleted in carbon-13. So we're diluting the carbon-13. These are measurements at extraordinarily high precision, but they're one of the many measurements that help us to pinpoint the fact that this build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is not due to carbon dioxide coming out of the oceans, for instance. It's due to principally to combustion of fossil fuels. There are many lines of evidence which indicate that. This is one. The final picture, the green one at the bottom, is another triumph of measurement. It is essentially the amount of oxygen in the air. Now, we know that oxygen constitutes 20% of the atmosphere. Why would that be changing? The answer is that as we burn fossil fuels, we're also taking a small fraction of that oxygen and turning it into carbon dioxide. This does not mean that we're going to run out of oxygen anytime soon. That's absolutely not a threat at all. However, the fact that we can measure that decrease in oxygen is another pointer, another fingerprint that enables us to pinpoint the reasons why CO2 is increasing. And the other point about that picture is that the dots on the left, these ones out here, are the ones obtained from the Cape Grim Air Archive, that rack of flasks, 4 times before the ability to measure oxygen in the atmosphere was developed. And of course, recognising that oxygen is 20% of the atmosphere, and this is a tiny percentage change, this is a phenomenally accurate measurement. It's a triumph, the fact that this measurement can be done. By the way, the person who developed the instrument to do it is Ralph Keeling, the son of Charles Keeling. So Charles Keeling essentially nailed CO2, Ralph Keeling has nailed oxygen. It's quite a symmetry. We can go even further back, and we can do it now using air which is trapped for us. Of course, we don't have an archive of this air, but we do have air trapped in a number of places, and one of the most important is in ice cores. We can study the tiny bubbles of air that are trapped in that ice and analyse all sorts of things about them, the composition of various atmospheric gases and various isotope ratios. When we do that, the laboratory in Aspendale near Melbourne has created a record of which this is the main part for the concentrations running back 1,000 years now for carbon dioxide, the orange, methane, the top bluey colour, and nitrous oxide, the slightly more bluey colour down the bottom. They're all increasing, and we know from many lines of evidence that the main increase is because of human activities. Oh, and the other thing we see from that picture is that through the period prior to about 1800, things were pretty steady. There was very little change in the concentrations of those gases in the atmosphere. And it turns out that if we go back another few thousand years, that remains the case. For about the last 8,000 years, roughly, these concentrations have been remarkably stable. And with it, climate on our planet has also been remarkably stable. That, perhaps not coincidentally, is the period through which human civilization evolved. We evolved in a time of remarkable, our civilization that is, evolved in a time of remarkable climatic stability. By civilization, I mean everything that followed from the invention of agriculture independently in about 4 regions of the world. But we can go back even further. We have ice cores that can go back almost 1 million years, over 800,000 years, and when we go back that far, we see that this stability of climate for the last 8,000 or so years breaks down completely. Climate is far from stable over that period of time. We see enormous oscillations of about 5 degrees in temperature and 100 parts per million in CO2 concentration. And you see on the right there what's happening to CO2 at the moment. If we put the present CO2 concentration, or extend this graph to the present, it looks about like that, the top dot. We've gone off the scale of this graph. We've taken CO2 well outside the operating range that the planet has experienced over the whole of that 800,000 years. So that brief mention of ice provides an entry to another extremely important part of the climate and environment for Australia, the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean, in addition to being obviously perhaps the dominant influence on the weather in the southern part of our continent, is globally important because it is one of the main drivers, perhaps the largest single driver, of what's called the overturning circulation. That's the ocean circulation by which the deep ocean breathes, by which the deep ocean contacts the atmosphere, not strongly, but strongly enough that significant amounts of material, including energy and carbon dioxide and other things, are exchanged between the atmosphere and the deep ocean. And in doing so, that deep ocean, the ocean on average is about 4 kilometres deep, enormously deep, the ocean moderates the pace of climate change. And there's been some fabulous work in Australia, among others by Steve Rintoul, to determine the dynamics of this overturning circulation. You see here a picture which looks a little complicated, but it contains one fairly simple idea, and that is that deep water at these intermediate levels about there flows more or less south. Obviously, it's got some east-west flow as well, but the important flow from this point of view is south. It contacts the surface, and when it does that, it flows in two directions. Some of it goes north, some of it goes south towards Antarctica, and once it goes south, it sinks and forms so-called Antarctic bottom water. And the combination of those two flows are the principal driver by which this critical exchange between the deep ocean and the atmosphere occurs. This is absolutely fundamentally important dynamics, not just for Australia, but for the world, because in essence it determines how quickly the ocean flywheel acts to provide some inertia in the climate system, acts to slow climate change. With climate change, of course, we are seeing rise in sea levels, and this has been monitored around the world, and in particular in Australia, by many scientists. In particular, I'd like to mention John Church, colleague involved in the same project that Sue mentioned, the Questions and Answers project. And this is the record of tide gauge data, the blue line with the turquoise uncertainty band around it, superimposed on data from satellites which can measure the elevation of the ocean surface to phenomenal accuracy, essentially by looking at changes in the Earth's gravity. The most recent part of this record is shown here. Once again, a combination of several different sorts of measurement. Two important things about this little snapshot of the record. The first is that sea levels continuing to rise at about just over 3 millimetres per year. The second is that it doesn't do that steadily. Sometimes it goes up faster and sometimes it goes up slower, and every now and then, like there, it actually goes down. And for a period in 2010 to 2011, sea level fell globally by a bit over 5 millimetres. It turns out that Australia, the Australian continent, was a big player in this fall because the reason why sea level fell, about half of that fall was due to the fact that after our big drought, the long drought, the Australian continent was drinking in water. You'll recall in the pictures from the Water Availability Project that the rainfall in those 2 years was very, very blue. It was wetter than average. And the consequence of that increased rainfall was that the Australian continent had a global effect on sea level. It actually sucked water out of the ocean, sucked 5 millimetres of water, about half of 5 millimetres of water. Most of the rest was sucked out by South America, where similar dynamics were playing out. So our continent, which lots of people think of as, in the global scale, a bit dry and boring, can actually have global effects on important things like sea level. I mentioned the records that we have of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And one of the important things that we can do with those records, together with some other observations, is to construct what's called a carbon dioxide budget. That is a measure or an account of how much carbon dioxide is flowing into the atmosphere and how much is flowing out. And this shows us the main features of that account. The upper line shows fossil fuel emissions, the pinky bit at the top. The contribution of deforestation used to be dominant a century ago. It's now decreasing. Of all that carbon dioxide flowing in, three things happen. A bit less than a half stays in the atmosphere and causes that progressive rise in fossil fuel, in atmospheric concentrations that we measure. Of the other slightly more than half, some goes into the oceans, partly because of this overturning circulation that Steve Rintoul and others have figured out, and some goes into land systems. And the amount that goes into land systems is a very important component of the ecosystem service that the whole carbon cycle provides to humans. The reason it's important is that if it wasn't there, together with the ocean sink, if these two weren't there, then climate change would be proceeding about twice as fast as it actually is. These are important buffers on the speed of climate change, and they're an entirely natural phenomenon. Human management does not intervene in these things. And just one little sidelight about that. When we talk about using the terrestrial biosphere in Australia as a carbon sink, as a means of soaking up carbon through programs like Carbon Farming Initiative and others, what we're talking about is artificially adding a bit to that natural sink. You'll notice the natural sink is enormously variable. Anything we add is likewise going to be subject to that variability. What's more, we have to measure it to the point where we know that we are not double counting. We're not drawing from this massive ecosystem service and calling it our own, because the atmosphere won't allow that. The atmosphere won't allow cheating of this carbon budget. Fossil fuel emissions, I've mentioned a couple of times. This shows the trajectory over the last 2 centuries of fossil fuel emissions, together with 4 scenarios, the ones that were used in the recent Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change Assessment report. The important thing about this is that if we zoom in on the current period, we see that we're pretty much stuck on the upper trajectory. We are not succeeding in getting onto any trajectory at the moment which would be consistent with containing climate change. So that brings me to the synthesis part of this talk, and I'd like to look very briefly at 3 synthesis activities. The first is climate change, the one I've just mentioned. The other 2 are the concept of the Earth system as an interacting dance between nature and humans, and the idea of evolution and emergence, in particular with regard to the Earth system. So climate change, how do we know it's happening? We're measuring it. This is a total of 10 records, and all I want you to do is to notice that we can measure everything from air temperatures up here, various measures of sea surface temperature, sea levels, snow cover. Here's a particularly important one, Arctic ice cover, which has decreased by 60% over the last 2 decades. We have only 40% as much ice cover in the Arctic as we did back then, and others. If we look ahead using climate models, which essentially are weather models writ large, the same sorts of models that we use to make our daily weather forecasts, there are many differences, but the similarities are more than the differences, with a number of other components describing things like the carbon cycle and so on, but now run not to make a deterministic forecast that it will rain next week, but rather a statistical forecast that the climate over the next decade or 3 or 10 decades will change in the following ways. And what we see is, in snapshot, a picture like this. The record of the past is the black line on the right. The record of the future is, observations on the left. The record of the future is on the right, projected for 2 different scenarios. The red is a high emission scenario, essentially what will happen if we do not succeed in significantly reducing fossil fuel emissions. The blue is the opposite. It's what will happen if we do succeed in reducing fossil fuel emissions enough to hold warming to about 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. And of course, the trajectories are very, very different. When you look at what those trajectories imply, I've only shown here the models for temperature on the left and rainfall on the right in the high emissions scenario. We see for temperature, for example, that in the Arctic, things get very, very hot, 6 degrees or more of warming, in some places 10. The land surfaces warm on the whole more than the oceans, but everywhere warms, on average by about 4 degrees. That's a lot. On the right, we see the projection for rainfall. Rainfall's a lot harder to project, but there are a couple of signals that emerge. The first is that the world on average will be wetter. This is a fairly straightforward projection to make. And the second is that it won't be wetter uniformly. It will be much wetter in some places, and in some places it's likely, with still some uncertainties, that the future will be drier. And the main places where the future is likely to be drier are the middle latitude high pressure belts, including, of course, southern Australia. I'll pass that one for time reasons and come to the second grand synthesis that we're looking at, which is the notion of the Earth system as a whole, sometimes called, the modern era in the Earth system is sometimes called the Anthropocene, the era in which human activities are reshaping the functioning of the planet itself. And a very prominent paper published about 5 years ago by Johan Rockstrom and colleagues identified 9 ways in which this is happening. Biodiversity loss, climate change, and the cycling of nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. And in those 3, that analysis concluded that humankind has already moved the Earth system outside what could be called a safe operating space, by which they meant an operating space which was of the same kind as that 8,000 years of relative stability through which human civilizations evolved. So we are having very significant effects. The last synthesis idea that I want to touch on is to do with emergence and evolution. And to me, these are absolutely critical concepts. Of course, they're borrowed from biology and ecology, but I think that they're worth diffusing much more widely than that. And the idea that I'd like to point to is, what was for me highlighted in a book by Dan Dennett, in fact a philosopher rather than a scientist, who has spent much time at ANU. And he wrote a book in the mid-90s called Darwin's Dangerous Idea, in which he put forward the idea that the evolutionary algorithm, essentially just 3 steps: diversify, select the successful outcomes from the diversification, and amplify those selected successful outcomes, is the universal engine for the emergence of complexity in biota, ecosystems, economies, technologies, and cultures. Now, why would that be relevant to climate change? It's because climate change is being driven by these very same increases in complexity that we are looking at in this list. Climate change is one of the outcomes of this engine. And to that extent, if we can appreciate a little more about how the engine is working, it might help us to understand and eventually limit climate change, along with a series of other threats that are arising from human pressures on the Earth in the Anthropocene. The second book that I've found fascinating in this area is one by Harold Morowitz, another biologist, and this was for me a breathtaking book, and in it he looked at 28 emergences running all the way from the Big Bang to us. So if you want a history of everything, this is it. His emergences start with the primordium, the emergence of large structure, the large-scale structure of the universe as we're beginning to see it, and then the evolution of stars, elements, and so on, through a number of steps to do with the evolution of life. Let's pass very quickly through and come to great apes, hominids. We suddenly recognise ourselves, and all of a sudden things changed. About step 23, toolmakers. We're starting to learn how to change the Earth system itself. And although the first signs of this happened maybe 500,000 years ago, maybe more, the consequences are now at a sufficient planetary scale that we're starting to see those effects. Agriculture, technology and urbanisation. And then in the last two steps of Morowitz's set of emergences, we see again something different. The emergence of philosophy. Of course, many cultures have philosophies, but the fact that we humans are able to reflect on our place in the universe to some extent, and with many limitations around that statement, we can choose our place in the universe. And the spiritual, our questioning of who we are, why we're here, and what we want to do with the phenomenal gift that arises from the sheer fact that we are here. So the final part of this talk, and very briefly, is to use those ideas of synthesis to do some reflections about environmental science and human society. And I want to begin with this final little reflection with the idea of narratives. And I'd like to thank Hilary, my wife, who's sitting down the front there, who first helped me realise the importance of this. Narratives, in the sense that I'm going to use them in the next couple of minutes, are stories that guide and empower actions. That they're not day-to-day stories, they're not the commonplace. They're very powerful, they're fundamental to being human, they're strong medicine, they engage us, they move us, but most importantly, they encode and transmit and propagate values or ethics. They are, if you will, ethical DNA. That I spoke a moment ago about evolution. Here we're seeing evolution, I believe, playing out in our ethical frameworks and our ethical discourses, and the DNA, the transmission medium and the diversification medium upon which that evolution plays out is narrative. Of course, this idea has some ancestors. Many people have thought, as far as I can tell, not in a particularly coordinated way, but certainly there's been a lot of effort to explore ideas like this. Walter Fisher coined the phrase homo narrans. People often speak about homo this or homo that. His phrase is homo narrans. We're essentially a storytelling species, according to him. And he believes that narration is the fundamental human paradigm, the human communication paradigm. We understand each other not through mathematics or anything like that, but primarily because we tell stories. Roger Schenck, in fact a computer scientist who posed the question, if I built a truly intelligent computer, how would I know that it was intelligent? Is it because it could beat Kasparov at chess? Probably not. Been there, done that. And those computers are not particularly bright, for instance, crossing the road. His answer was that an intelligent computer could tell a story. John Dryzek, a colleague at ANU, has, now at the University of Canberra, has discussed the politics of the earth in terms of what he calls environmental discourses, stories that people construct around the relationship between humans and the environment. And of those discourses, we can think about a number of families, if you will. Some examples might be a spectrum running from stories of a benign world through to stories of a malign world, or stories of individual centrality in our social organisation through to collective or societal centrality. And the one that we are able to focus on in the context of thinking about the environment is stories about expansion of the human species versus sustenance. And expansion, of course, is the dominant narrative that we've seen over the last maybe 2 centuries, and it continues to be a dominant narrative today. It holds essentially that we've got where we are over that period by growth of the human enterprise, and that growth is driven by economies, by technologies and so forth. And in order for things to keep getting better, which in some sense everybody wants, we have to keep growing. The sustenance narrative takes the opposite view, well, not an opposite view, it takes a view which differs strongly from the expansion narrative in one crucial respect, and that is that we have reached the limits of our finite planet in certain important respects, those ones identified in Rockstrom's picture of the Anthropocene. Climate change, of course, is a paramount example. And in order for us to continue to survive and thrive and improve our well-being as a species, we need to learn to live within those limits, and those are largely limits on material consumption and throughput. We have enough stuff, is the basis of this narrative. So if we think about narratives now as evolutionary entities, we can look at the idea that narratives, essentially as ethical DNA, are sequences of memes, of story elements that can evolve. And they do so by precisely that Darwinian algorithm of diversification, selection and adaptation. And if we think of it that way, then we can conjecture that evolution is a process that we can understand. We're doing that in a number of different domains. It can to some extent be influenced, and an example of influencing evolution is the fact that we breed crops. We breed the crops that supply the food we eat, and we have done so for millennia. Of course, evolution fundamentally can't be controlled because it contains, the whole algorithm contains enormous stochastic components, but it can be directed. And so the implications of that might be that if we're thinking about shaping our shared future, this relationship between humans and the environment, this evolutionary interplay between the expansion and sustenance narratives is just as important as the dynamics of the natural world that I've spent most of this talk talking about. We need this bridge between the natural world and people who think about the way that humans work and evolve and develop their ideas. And we're collectively trying to guide the evolution, I think we're already trying to do this, of resilient narratives, narratives which can last and survive shocks, that will empower a transition to a society that's both sustainable and improves global well-being at the same time. So my hope for myself and I guess for all of you is that we exert some selection pressure on the narratives that we tell each other, that we learn to develop our narratives in ways that can shape the stories, that we can choose our stories. We can't choose our facts, but we can choose our stories. And that we can, through that narrative evolution, deal with many of the challenges that we are faced as a society, and that the science of the environment has highlighted for us. So the last slide I would like to leave you with is that the science of the natural environment, as we've seen it grow, particularly over the last half century or so, embraces many spheres and disciplines, all the way from atmospheres through to ecosystems and biodiversity. Australia, of course, along with many, many other nations and as part of a global scientific community, has made enormous contributions. In the future, we're at the beginning of this epoch in which human activities are significantly impacting on the function of the planet in all sorts of ways. Climate, cycles of important elements like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, land, water, biodiversity. And in doing this, our biggest challenge, I think, is synthesis. Thinking not only within the disciplinary boxes or homes that we grew up in, but more broadly. And as we do that, our big challenges are to develop emerging environmental understandings that will remain true to the fundamental ethic of science, that is, the ethic of objectivity, discerning objective realities, but also reflect those objective realities to our society in ways that influence how people think and the stories they tell to each other, and thus contribute to these new societal ethics that we trust will help us through what's a pivotal time in the history of our species. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. I expected a thought-provoking lecture, and that's exactly what we've got. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but but we do have time outside for over drinks and so forth. But I'd just like to give anybody with a burning question the opportunity to ask now if they'd like to, or we could return. And just bearing in mind that this is actually being broadcast or streamed live, if anybody has a question, please put their hand up and we'll bring a microphone to you. So any takers? There's one over there. Yeah.
I'm wondering how we can include politicians in these narratives, because it seems to... I'm wondering how we can include politicians in these narratives, because it seems to me that they're not understanding... Well, our current federal politicians, both sides, I think, don't have a clue about Earth systems science and the limits to growth that we're experiencing. I mean, their narrative is all growth, 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 and no understanding of the limits of the physical world.
Couldn't agree more. And the events of the last week or so, where we had a prominent businessman announcing the coming of the next ice age, I think reflect the poverty of the public discourse and the fact that this stuff can even be taken seriously. This is flat Earth stuff. It's got no relationship with empirical, objective science, whatever. It's cherry picking of about 1% of the information, taking it completely out of context. It's equivalent to deleting 19 words in 20 out of a book and reading the remaining 5 and drawing some conclusion from them. It's nonsense. So yes, I think our opportunity, our challenge, is through whatever means we have to broaden that conversation. And my admiration goes to all of those who are doing that in the public debate. And I think Tim Flannery's he's made enormous contributions to doing that. Bob Brown has made enormous contributions. We could mention a number of others. But in every case, what they're doing is thinking not only about questions of how we should face the next challenge of timescale, a week or a month, but how we should face much, much longer and deeper challenges. And they're framing our responses to these shorter-term challenges in that longer-term picture. So I think we all have the opportunity to participate in that conversation, even if it's ringing up local members and urging them to take a broader view, because you can understand the pressures they're under. They're, on both sides of politics from within their own frames. People see that they don't see outside that, and the critical thing is to open those windows.
Well, as I said, unfortunately, we have to wrap up in here, but that was a valuable question to open up a whole lot of other conversations that could be had. So I would like you to join me, please, in thanking Mike for, he said he was going to give us a view of environmental science. He did that, but he's given us so much more. So please join me.
Thank you.